Chicago in the 1920s wasn't just a city, it was a battlefield. The streets weren't ruled by politicians or lawmen, but by ruthless gangsters with Tommy guns and a simple rule: kill or be killed. Every week, another body dropped. Every night, another deal was sealed in blood. The St. Valentine's Day Massacre became the face of Chicago's gang wars, but it was just one chapter in a story soaked in violence. The newspapers sensationalized the headlines. They called it Gangland, Chicago. Painted stories of ruthless killers carving out their territories in back alleys, hidden speakeasies, and crowded street corners. But for those who lived in the city, this wasn't just a story, it was reality. A reality where an evening stroll could end in a rain of bullets, where an argument over territory meant a death sentence, where the sound of a car backfiring sent people diving for cover because it could just as easily have been gunfire. It wasn't just about the booze. Prohibition had fueled the fire, sure, turning liquor into gold and turning men into killers to protect it. But this war wasn't about alcohol anymore. It was about power. It was about dominance. It was about respect. And in Chicago's underworld, respect wasn't given, it was taken, one corpse at a time. Al Capone, Johnny Torrio, Dean O'Banion, Jaime Weiss. The names became legend, but legends aren't built on success alone. They're built on blood. And before Chicago's streets were soaked with it, before the walls of warehouses were splattered with the remains of men who had crossed the wrong boss, before 7 men were lined up against a garage wall on February 14, 1929, there were already massacres, betrayals, and executions that told the real story of how this city became a war zone. This war had no rules. There were no fair fights, no codes of honor, no moments of mercy. There was only one truth. Everyone was expendable. It didn't matter if you were a foot soldier or a boss, if you had made millions or were still clawing your way up the ranks. One wrong move, one moment of weakness, one miscalculation, and you were dead. Sometimes it happened quickly, a single gunshot in the back of the head. Other times it was drawn out, bodies riddled with bullets, left on sidewalks as warnings. In Chicago, death came in many forms. A silent execution in the back of a speakeasy, a brutal ambush on the streets of downtown, a well-orchestrated hit in broad daylight with bystanders watching in horror. The city was a chessboard, and every move could be your last. The police, they were spectators, sometimes enforcers, sometimes enemies, but rarely the ones in control. Investigations went nowhere. Witnesses forgot what they saw. Corruption ran deep, and the law was just another tool for those who had the money to buy it. Cops and criminals walked the same streets, drank in the same clubs, shared the same secrets. And when the bullets flew, the authorities were often the last to react, if they reacted at all. And so, Chicago became a place where men like Dean O'Banion thrived. O'Banion wasn't just another thug. He wasn't just a bootlegger, though he controlled some of the best liquor flowing through the North Side. He wasn't just a businessman, though he ran a flower shop that doubled as his headquarters. He was a man with charm, with wit, with a smile that could disarm even his deadliest rivals. But more than anything, O'Banion was a man who didn't know fear. That was his mistake. He had built his empire on charm and ruthlessness, laughing in the face of danger, making enemies out of the wrong men. He outplayed Johnny Torrio. He humiliated Al Capone. He stole shipments from under their noses, mocked their failures, pushed too far. And in the underworld, there was only so much you could get away with before the scales tipped against you. On the morning of November 10, 1924, O'Banion had no idea that his time had run out. He was standing in his flower shop on North State Street, a place he had operated for years. A front, like so many businesses in Chicago, but a functional one. The gangsters of the city all came to O'Banion for their floral arrangements when a fellow bootlegger, a rival, or a friend was put in the ground. Flowers and funerals went hand in hand, and business was always good. It was a routine morning. The shop smelled of roses, lilies, fresh cut stems. The sun shined through the glass windows, casting long shadows over the wooden floors. O'Banion was relaxed in his element. And then they walked in, 3 men. Well-dressed, calm, familiar faces, men O'Banion had seen before. There was nothing suspicious, nothing alarming. These were associates, men from the Sicilian faction of the Chicago outfit. He had worked with them, he had shared drinks with them, He greeted them with his usual grin, wiping his hands on his apron. One of the men, Frankie Aiello, extended his hand. A handshake, a simple gesture, one O'Banion had exchanged thousands of times before. As their hands met, as O'Banion gripped Aiello's fingers, everything changed. Aiello tightened his grip, holding O'Banion in place, and in that moment, before he could react, before he could step back, before he could do anything, two other men pulled out their revolvers and opened fire. The first shot slammed into his chest, knocking the air from his lungs. Then another. Then another. 5 bullets tore through his body, shattering ribs, ripping through muscle, embedding into his flesh. His back hit the counter. Blood spilled onto the lilies, soaking into the stems. He gasped, but no sound came out. And then, silence. The men didn't say a word. They didn't check if he was still breathing. They had done their job, and they left. By the time someone found him, the blood had already begun to pool on the floor. The man who had once ruled the North Side, the man who had laughed in the face of danger, the man who had built his empire through charm and violence, was gone. His murder wasn't just another killing. It was the beginning of something much worse. Because in Chicago, when one man fell, another always rose to take his place. And every death demanded revenge. The war had only just begun. Johnny Torrio should have never come back to Chicago. After the murder of Dion O'Banion, the streets were tense. It was only a matter of time before the North Side retaliated. No one in the underworld ever truly got away with murder. Every killing created a debt that had to be repaid in blood. The only question was when and how. Torrio, the man who had ordered O'Banion's execution, believed he was untouchable. He had built the Chicago outfit into an empire, controlled bootlegging, gambling, and vice with ruthless efficiency. He was rich, powerful, and most importantly, careful. But even the most careful men make mistakes. And in early 1925, he made the biggest one of his life. He came back home. On the afternoon of January 24th, Torrio had just returned from a shopping trip with his wife. They had been out picking up groceries, mundane, routine, the kind of thing that made Torrio feel safe. He had grown comfortable, complacent. He didn't think anyone would dare come for him in broad daylight. But the North Side gang had been waiting. As Torrio stepped out of his car, arms full of bags, the attack came fast. A black touring car screeched to a stop. Doors flew open. 2 men jumped out, Jaime Weiss and Vincent Drucci, O'Banion's closest allies. They had waited months for this moment, and now there would be no hesitation. The first bullet hit Torrio in the chest. The impact sent him staggering back against his car, groceries spilling onto the pavement. The second shot tore through his stomach. He collapsed, gasping, hands trembling as he clutched his wounds. But Weiss and Drucci weren't finished. As he lay there, bleeding out, Weiss stepped closer, aimed his pistol directly at Torrio's head. This was it. This was how the boss of the Chicago outfit would die, on the sidewalk in front of his wife, executed like a nobody. But then, the gun clicked. Empty. Weiss had run out of bullets. For a second, everything froze. He cursed, fumbled for another weapon. But the delay was just long enough for sirens to cut through the air. The attackers panicked, jumped back into their car, and disappeared down the street. Johnny Torrio was still alive. Barely. He was rushed to the hospital, slipping in and out of consciousness. Doctors worked frantically, removing bullets, stabilizing him, keeping him from slipping into the void. He survived. But he was no longer the same man. As he lay in that hospital bed, staring at the ceiling, he realized something. This life, this war, it wasn't worth it. He had almost died over a dead man's feud. O'Banion was in the ground, but his gang still had power, and they had come within seconds of killing him in broad daylight. Torrio made his decision. As soon as he recovered, he called a meeting. The outfit needed new leadership. Someone younger, more ruthless. Someone who had been waiting in the shadows, hungry for power. That man was Al Capone. Weeks later, Torrio boarded a train and left Chicago for good. He retired to Italy, abandoning the empire he had built, leaving it in the hands of a man who would take the city's violence to levels no one had seen before. The assassination attempt had failed, but in its failure, it had created a monster. Chicago had belonged to Johnny Torrio. Now, it belonged to Al Capone. The day Jaime Weiss was murdered, Chicago held its breath. No one had ever seen a man like Weiss before. If Dion O'Banion had been a gangster with a florist's charm, Weiss was something else entirely. cold, methodical, and utterly fearless. He didn't drink, he didn't womanize, he didn't gamble. He was in the business for one thing, and one thing only: revenge. Weiss had been O'Banion's right-hand man, and after his boss was gunned down in his own shop, Weiss had made it his mission to destroy the Chicago outfit. Every step he took was another move in a war that wouldn't end until Capone, Torrio, and every last one of their men were dead. And unlike most gangsters, Weiss didn't hide. He was the only man in Chicago who made Al Capone nervous. Not just because he was relentless, but because he had a death wish. When bullets started flying, Weiss didn't duck, he charged. Capone's men whispered that he was insane, that he couldn't be killed. But even the most fearless men eventually faced their reckoning. That reckoning came on October 11th, 1926. For months, Weiss had been orchestrating a relentless attack on Capone's empire. Drive-by shootings, bombings, ambushes. He had pushed Capone into a corner, and the outfit knew they had to eliminate him before he struck again. They set the trap at the one place Weiss thought he was safe, the North Side Gang headquarters, right across the street from the Holy Name Cathedral on State Street. Weiss should have seen it coming. That afternoon, Weiss, along with his right-hand man, Patrick "Paddy" Murray, and 3 other North Side associates, left their office at 740 North State Street. They had a meeting to attend, business as usual. The streets were busy, pedestrians walking by, cars rolling down the road. Nothing seemed out of place. What they didn't know was that across the street, hidden in a second-story room of an old tenement building, Capone's gunmen were waiting. At exactly 4 p.m., the shooting began. A deafening explosion of gunfire tore through the street. From the upstairs window, Capone's hitmen unloaded on Weiss and his men with a torrent of bullets. A dozen shotgun blasts and more than 10,000 rounds from Thompson submachine guns rained down on them, tearing through the pavement, shattering storefront windows, sending bystanders screaming and diving for cover. Weiss didn't get a chance to draw his gun. The first bullet struck him in the chest. Another ripped through his neck. His body lurched as more rounds tore into him, sending him sprawling onto the pavement. Blood pooled around him, staining the sidewalk. Paddy Murray tried to react, reaching for his own weapon, but a shotgun blast ripped through his skull, killing him instantly. The rest of Weiss's men scrambled for cover, but the damage had already been done. Then, as quickly as it started, the shooting stopped. Across the street, inside the church, priests and parishioners huddled behind pews, frozen in terror. The echoes of gunfire faded, replaced only by the distant screams of panicked onlookers. When the dust settled, Jaime Weiss was dead. The one man who had come closest to toppling Al Capone, the man who had been called the only guy Capone was ever truly afraid of, lay lifeless on the pavement, his ambition cut short by a carefully planned execution. Capone had won this round. But the war for Chicago was far from over, because for every gangster who fell, another one stepped up to take their place. And in a city drowning in blood, the killings would only get worse. Chicago's underworld didn't begin with Al Capone. Before Capone, before Johnny Torrio, before the city's streets ran red with gangland killings, there was Big Jim Colosimo, the man who built the empire that others would kill to control. In the early 1900s, Colosimo ruled Chicago's vice district with an iron fist. He wasn't just a gangster. He was the gangster, the undisputed boss of the city's underworld. He controlled hundreds of brothels, gambling dens, and saloons. He paid off the cops, the politicians, and the judges. He was larger than life, charismatic, wealthy, untouchable. But power in Chicago was never permanent. By 1920, Prohibition had changed everything. Booze had become the new gold, and Johnny Torrio, Colosimo's right-hand man, saw an opportunity. With alcohol now illegal, the gangs that controlled its flow could become richer than ever before. But there was one problem. Big Jim didn't want in. Colosimo was old school. He had built his empire on prostitution and gambling, and he saw bootlegging as too risky, too much heat, too much trouble. He refused to get involved. That decision sealed his fate. Torrio wasn't the kind of man who took no for an answer. He had already brought in a young, ambitious enforcer from Brooklyn, Al Capone, to help expand operations. And with Colosimo standing in the way of progress, a decision was made. Big Jim had to go. The trap was set. On May 11th, 1920, Colosimo was at his restaurant, Colosimo's Cafe, a lavish, upscale spot on 22nd Street where Chicago's elite dined alongside politicians and underworld figures. That evening, Colosimo received a phone call. His new wife, Dale Winter, a young singer he had recently married after divorcing his first wife, was expecting a delivery at the restaurant. A shipment of something important. Big Jim had no reason to be suspicious. He arrived at the cafe alone. No bodyguards. No warning. The restaurant was nearly empty. The staff was in the back, cleaning up for the evening. Colosimo waited near the entrance, adjusting his suit, humming a tune to himself. Then, without a sound, a figure stepped inside. A single gunshot rang out. The bullet hit Colosimo right behind his left ear, tearing through his skull. He crumpled to the floor instantly. No struggle. No dramatic last words. One moment, he was a king. The next, he was just another body on Chicago's long list of murders. The assassin? No one was ever officially charged, but rumors swirled. Some said it was Al Capone himself, his first major hit in Chicago, a way to prove his loyalty to Torrio. Others pointed to Frankie Yale, a notorious New York hitman brought in for the job. What was clear was that Johnny Torrio had ordered the hit. The moment Colosimo's body hit the ground, the old era of Chicago's underworld was over. Torrio stepped in, took control, and within months, the city's criminal empire was fully entrenched in bootlegging. And with Colosimo out of the way, a new name would soon rise to power. Al Capone. The death of Big Jim wasn't just another killing. It was the beginning of Chicago's bloodiest years, a city where bullets settled every dispute and where the cost of power was always measured in bodies. And this was just the start. Joe Esposito had once been untouchable. Before Al Capone dominated Chicago, before the city's gang wars turned the streets into a battlefield, Esposito was one of the most powerful men in town. He wasn't just a gangster. He was a politician, a businessman, a power broker. He had the police in his pocket, the politicians under his thumb, and the Italian vote at his command. But by 1928, the world Esposito had built was crumbling. The Chicago outfit was growing too big, too ambitious. The old way of doing business, smoky backroom deals, quiet bribes, handshake agreements, was being replaced by machine guns, street executions, and absolute loyalty. Esposito had tried to balance both worlds. He had been a mentor to Capone, a key figure in the city's Italian political machine. But he made a fatal mistake. He thought he could be independent. He believed he could keep his power without fully bending to the outfit. And in Capone's world, that wasn't an option. The warning signs. In the months leading up to his death, Esposito's enemies had been growing louder. Capone and his men saw him as an obstacle, a relic of the past who refused to accept that the city belonged to them now. There were warnings, subtle at first. A few of Esposito's men disappeared. Some of his businesses were suddenly raided. His political allies stopped taking his calls, but Esposito refused to step aside. He still thought he had power. He still believed that his name alone could protect him. He was wrong. The murder. On the evening of March 21st, 1928, Esposito sat outside his home on 90th and Loomis Boulevard, enjoying the fresh air. His wife was inside cooking dinner. His friends had just left. He had no reason to suspect that death was only seconds away. Then they came. A black sedan screeched to a halt in front of the house. The doors flew open. 3 men stepped out, Thompson submachine guns in hand. Before Esposito could react, the street erupted in gunfire. Dozens of rounds tore through his body. The force of the bullets slammed him backward, sending his chair toppling over. His hands clawed at the air, his body convulsing as the gunmen emptied their clips. The hit was brutal, deliberate. A public execution meant to send a message. When the smoke cleared, Esposito's lifeless body lay sprawled on the sidewalk, bullet holes riddling his chest, arms, and face. His killers didn't bother to check if he was dead. They already knew. The aftermath. His wife rushed outside, screaming, but the assassins were already gone. The neighbors, terrified, stayed behind their doors. No one saw anything. No one knew anything. That was the rule of Chicago. Esposito's murder was never officially solved. No one was arrested. No one was put on trial. But everyone in the city knew exactly who was behind it. Capone. It was a power shift. One less rival, one more block under his control. With Esposito gone, the last remnants of the old Chicago political machine crumbled. The message was clear. There was no room for the old bosses anymore. This was Capone's city, now, and anyone who thought otherwise would meet the same fate. By 1928, Frankie Yale had built himself into a legend. He wasn't just another gangster. He was the gangster of Brooklyn. A kingpin in his own right, he ran bootlegging operations, controlled a fleet of trucks smuggling liquor into New York, and had a network of killers ready to enforce his will. But Yale wasn't just a New York problem. He had deep ties to Chicago. Years earlier, Johnny Torrio had called him in for a job, the assassination of Big Jim Colosimo. Yale had come through, proving himself reliable, ruthless, and efficient. When Al Capone rose to power, Yale became one of his closest business partners, supplying Chicago with illegal shipments of whiskey from the East Coast. It was a profitable partnership, until Capone decided he didn't need Yale anymore. Capone had grown paranoid. He was convinced that Yale was cheating him, skimming profits, selling booze to his rivals. Whether it was true or not didn't matter. In Capone's world, loyalty was absolute, and even the suspicion of betrayal was a death sentence. The setup. The hit on Frankie Yale wasn't rushed. It was calculated. Capone's men followed his movements, tracked his habits, studied his routes. They waited for the perfect moment to strike, a moment when Yale would be vulnerable, alone, and unable to escape. That moment came on the afternoon of July 1st, 1928, the ambush. Yale was driving through Brooklyn in his brand-new custom Lincoln coupe, a symbol of his success, his wealth, his untouchable status. What he didn't know was that he was already a dead man. As he cruised down 44th Street, a black sedan pulled up behind him. Another appeared in front, blocking his path. Before Yale could react, the gunfire began. From the first car, Capone's hitmen unleashed a storm of bullets. The windshield shattered. Glass exploded. Yale's hands fumbled at the steering wheel as slugs tore through his chest, arms, and neck. His foot slammed on the gas in a desperate attempt to escape, but the car veered out of control. Bullets riddled the tires, the engine, the doors. Then, the final shot, a shotgun blast to the skull. The impact sent Yale's car crashing into a building. Smoke poured from the wreckage. His lifeless body slumped over the wheel, blood dripping onto the dashboard. The killers didn't stop to check their work. They didn't need to. Frankie Yale was dead. The aftermath. For the first time in New York's history, a gangland murder had been carried out using Thompson submachine guns, Chicago's signature weapon. The city was in shock. This wasn't a quiet assassination or a back-alley stabbing. This was a public execution in broad daylight, a display of power meant to send a message. And the message was clear. If you crossed Al Capone, there was no place you could hide. Not even in New York, not even in your own car, not even in broad daylight. The old alliances were gone. Loyalty was dead. And in the world of organized crime, the only thing that mattered was who pulled the trigger first. Jack Zuta was never meant to be a gangster. He wasn't a muscle-bound enforcer or a feared gunman. He was a bookish accountant, a man more comfortable with ledgers than Tommy guns. But in Chicago's underworld, money was just as deadly as bullets. And when you handled money for the mob, you were never truly safe. By 1930, Zuta had become one of the most important figures in organized crime. He laundered money, arranged bribes, and kept the gears of corruption turning. He worked for both the North Side Gang and at times Capone's outfit. But as gangland tensions boiled over, his position became a death trap. Zuta had information, too much information. He knew where the bodies were buried. He knew who was on the payroll. He knew which politicians were being bought and which gangsters were skimming off the top. And in the world of Chicago crime, knowing too much was the fastest way to die. In mid-1930, the fragile peace between Chicago's gangs collapsed into open warfare. Capone was tightening his grip on the city, and Zuta, sensing the tides turning, made a fatal mistake. He aligned himself with the remnants of the North Side Gang, the last group still standing against Capone. Zuta was no fighter, but he was a strategist. He funneled money to Capone's enemies, helped them rebuild, and even arranged hits on some of Capone's men. Capone found out, and that was all it took. The manhunt. On August 1st, 1930, Zuta's life came crashing down. He was sitting in a hotel lobby when a group of Capone's men stormed in, guns drawn. Zuta barely escaped, bolting out the back door, jumping into a waiting car. He had become a hunted man. The next 24 hours were chaos. Zuta fled Chicago, leaving behind his businesses, his accounts, everything. He hopped between small towns, trying to find a place to hide. That place would be Delafield, Wisconsin, a quiet rural town far from the blood-soaked streets of Chicago. He checked into a small resort called the Lakeview Hotel, hoping to lay low until the heat died down. But Capone's reach extended far beyond the city, and Zuta had no idea that his executioners were already on their way. The execution. On the evening of August 1st, 1930, Zuta sat in the hotel lobby, reading a newspaper. It was a peaceful night. The summer air was thick with the sounds of crickets, the faint hum of distant cars. Then, a black sedan pulled up outside. 5 men stepped out, dressed in suits, moving with purpose. They walked straight into the hotel without a word. Inside, the guests barely had time to react before gunfire erupted. The assassins unloaded their Thompson submachine guns, spraying the lobby with bullets. Glass shattered, furniture exploded, blood splattered the walls. Zuta had no time to run. The bullets tore through his body, arms, chest, throat, face. He collapsed instantly, his newspaper falling beside him, stained red. The shooting lasted less than 10 seconds, then silence. The gunmen turned, calmly walked out, got back into their car, and disappeared into the night. The aftermath. When the police arrived, they found a scene of devastation. Zuta's body was riddled with bullets. Over 60 rounds had been fired. It was more than a hit. It was a statement. No safe houses, no hiding, no mercy. The newspapers called it the murder castle. It was one of the most brutal, public executions of the era. Proof that Capone's enemies had nowhere to run. Zuta had tried to escape the game. But once you were in, the only way out was in a coffin. By the late 1920s, Antonio "Tough" Tony Lombardo was more than just a gangster. He was a bridge between two worlds. He wasn't just Capone's right-hand man. He was also the head of the Italo-American National Union, a powerful organization that controlled Chicago's Italian vote. This made him invaluable, not only to Capone, but to corrupt politicians who relied on mob influence. But with power came enemies. The North Side Gang had been gunning for Capone for years, and by 1928, the war had reached its boiling point. After the assassination of their previous boss, Bugs Moran had taken over, and he wasn't interested in peace. Lombardo had become a prime target. Taking him out wouldn't just be a hit, it would be a statement, and Moran was ready to send that message. The setup. Lombardo wasn't reckless. He knew he was a marked man. For months, he had been traveling with bodyguards, avoiding predictable routines, keeping his movements quiet. But in Chicago, no one was untouchable. On the afternoon of September 7, 1928, Lombardo was walking down Madison Street, just outside a bank. It was broad daylight. The sidewalks were crowded, the streetcars were running, businessmen were going about their day. Lombardo felt safe. He wasn't. The hit. From across the street, 2 men emerged from the crowd. They weren't just ordinary hitmen. They were North Side assassins, experts at killing in the open, slipping away before the police could react. They walked briskly toward Lombardo. No masks, no hesitation. Then in an instant, they pulled out their revolvers and opened fire. The first shot hit Lombardo in the head. Blood sprayed across the sidewalk. His body staggered, his hands instinctively reaching out, but the killers didn't stop. 3 more shots, chest, stomach, throat. Lombardo collapsed face first onto the pavement, his blood pooling beneath him. His bodyguard tried to react, but it was too late. The gunman turned and disappeared into the crowd, vanishing into the chaos of downtown Chicago. The aftermath. The attack was over in seconds, but its impact sent shockwaves through the city. Lombardo's assassination wasn't just another mob hit, it was an act of war. Capone had lost his political enforcer, his connection to the city's power structure. And the North Side Gang? They had sent a clear message. No one in Capone's empire was safe. The streets of Chicago had already been soaked in blood. But after Lombardo's murder, the violence would escalate into something even deadlier. Something that would lead straight to the Valentine's Day Massacre. By 1929, Chicago wasn't just a city. It was a battlefield. The streets were ruled by fear, loyalty, and revenge, and anyone caught in the middle could disappear overnight. Some men thrived in this chaos. Others overplayed their hand and paid the ultimate price. James "Jimmy the Gent" Annunziata was one of those men. He wasn't a high-ranking boss like Capone or Moran. He wasn't a legendary enforcer like Frank Nitti, but he knew too much. As a trusted lieutenant in the Chicago outfit, Jimmy had been deep in the mix of Capone's bootlegging operations. He handled bribes, arranged shipments, and ensured the right cops and politicians stayed quiet. But behind closed doors, Jimmy was doing something far more dangerous. He was playing both sides, and in Chicago's underworld, that was a death sentence. The double cross. For months, Capone's men had been whispering about a traitor in their ranks. Money had gone missing, deals had fallen through, information had leaked to the North Side gang. At first, no one suspected Jimmy. He was too loyal, too careful, too smart. But then, a fatal mistake. One of Capone's spies intercepted a message meant for Bugs Moran's crew. The details were damning. Jimmy had been feeding intelligence to Capone's enemies. Capone didn't need more proof. The verdict was in. The sentence? Death, the execution. The hit was meticulously planned. Capone didn't want Jimmy to just disappear. He wanted him to be a warning. On October 3, 1929, Jimmy received a call from an associate asking him to come to a small garage on the South Side. A routine meeting. Nothing unusual. But the moment Jimmy walked inside, he knew something was wrong. The garage was empty. Silent. Then, the door slammed shut behind him. Before he could react, the first bullet tore through his knee. Jimmy screamed, collapsing to the ground. Then, footsteps. Several men emerged from the shadows. They didn't rush. They didn't need to. Jimmy tried to crawl, blood pooling beneath him. Begging, pleading, swearing loyalty. But it was too late. The second shot hit his shoulder. The third hit his gut. Then, the final shot. Point blank to the head. Jimmy's body jerked once, then fell still. His killers didn't say a word. They simply walked out, leaving his corpse sprawled on the garage floor. The aftermath. The police found Jimmy's body the next morning. But no one asked too many questions. No witnesses, no suspects, just another dead gangster in a city full of them. But for Chicago's underworld, the message was clear. Betrayal had only one outcome, and no matter how high you climbed, no matter how much money you made, if you crossed Capone, you would end up in the dirt. By 1930, Joe Aiello was a dead man walking. For years, he had tried and failed to take down Al Capone. He wasn't just another rival gangster. Aiello was a sworn enemy, a man who had personally ordered hit after hit on Capone, only to watch every attempt end in blood and failure. But Aiello was relentless. He aligned himself with Capone's enemies, the North Side gang, Bugs Moran, even out-of-town mafia bosses. He plotted, schemed, waited for the perfect chance to strike. Capone, meanwhile, had grown tired of the games. Aiello had refused to back down. That meant there was only one way this would end. And on October 23, 1930, that moment finally came. The final betrayal. Aiello knew he was in trouble. Capone had placed a bounty on his head, and Chicago was swarming with killers eager to collect. He moved constantly, switching hitouts, bribing police, living in fear of every knock at the door. But fear wasn't enough to keep him safe. One of Aiello's own men, a man he trusted, betrayed him. The hit was set, the trap was in place. All that was left was for Aiello to step into it, the slaughter. That afternoon, Aiello was staying at a small apartment above the Rendezvous Café, a bakery restaurant on West Division Street. He was paranoid, exhausted and desperate, but still he believed he was safe. Then, without warning, gunfire erupted. From across the street, at least 3 machine gunners opened fire. The first bullets ripped through the windows, shattering glass, sending splinters flying. Aiello barely had time to react. He bolted for the door, but the bullets followed. 1, 2, 5, 10. A relentless stream of lead tore through his body, face, chest, arms, legs, dozens of rounds hitting flesh, bone, organs. Aiello stumbled into the hallway, bleeding, choking, trying to crawl away. More gunfire, more blood. Then, silence. His body slumped against the wall, riddled with over 50 bullets. His dream of taking down Capone had ended right there, in a pool of his own blood. The aftermath. Capone never said a word about Aiello's death. He didn't need to. The message was clear. Revenge was not an option. Fighting back was not an option. And anyone foolish enough to challenge Capone's empire would end up the same way, butchered in the streets, their names forgotten. Chicago wasn't ruled by law. It wasn't ruled by justice. It was ruled by blood. And in the end, that was the only rule that mattered. These were just a handful of the brutal killings that defined Chicago's gang wars. Every street had a story. Every alley hid a body. And this was just the tip of the iceberg. If you want to uncover more forgotten murders, more shocking betrayals, and the ruthless history of organized crime, make sure to subscribe, because in the world of the mob, the past never truly stays buried.